Hello, my name is Jonathan Marks, and I'm a biological anthropologist at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I want to talk for a few minutes about scientific racism. What do I mean by scientific racism? I mean the recruitment of science in furtherance of the evil political ends of racism. By racism, I mean the idea that the human species comes naturally partitionable into a small number of units, each with their own properties. That's the race part. And the ism part is that an individual can be judged by virtue of group membership. Racism, of course, is older than science, but in the modern age we look to science to legitimize our ideas. The best recent book on the subject, by the way, is by a British science journalist named Angela Saini, Superior, The Return of Race Science. Scientific racism is interesting to me for several reasons, but one in particular, professionally. I'm a scientist, and science is supposed to make people's lives better. Science that makes people's lives worse violates an old social contract from the 1600s and tends to incur torches and pitchforks and makes all of us scientists look bad. So when we look historically for scientific racism, what do we see? What we identify as scientific racism is really just a series of wrong answers to a basic question. Namely, why is there gross inequality? Social, political, economic, military. Why are there haves and have-nots? Colonized and colonizers, owners and laborers, nobles and peasants, free and enslaved. Two scientific answers crystallized in the mid-1800s. From the right, Arthur de Gobineau, known as the father of scientific racism, which I assure you is not a compliment, identifies the poverty, misery of Native Americans in their lousy brains. Using the Huron Indian as a metaphor for all Native Americans, he snarkily asks, "So, the brain of the Huron Indian contains in an undeveloped form an intellect which is absolutely the same as the Englishman or the Frenchman. Why then, in the course of the ages, has he not invented printing or steam power?" Well, the obvious answer is that they didn't know they were in a race, and that doesn't seem to have occurred to him. What's important, though, is that their problems are nobody's fault. They just have lousy brains. And from the left, Karl Marx says that's nonsense. One thing is clear. Nature does not produce owners of money or commodities on the one hand, and on the other, owners of only their own labor. This relationship has no basis in nature. It's obviously the result of an earlier historical development. In other words, biology is a red herring and has nothing to do with it. Inequality is the result of historical processes. And a century and a half of social science later, it's obvious who was right. Inequality is the result of human decisions and actions, politics, economics. So let's try and map out the history of scientific racism with a flowchart. The basic question is simple. Do we know the causes of gross economic, social, and political inequality? Do we know why there are a few very rich and a lot of very poor? Choice number one, yes we do, and it was explored most effectively and turgidly by Karl Marx. Differences in wealth are not the result of nature, but of history. Some of it evil, but involving exploitation, colonialism, slavery, greed, warfare, etc. The obvious consequence of that conclusion would be to work for greater economic equality. Nobody likes injustice, so let's work for justice. But that might be a distasteful answer, especially since it might cost you a lot of money. So option number two. Wow, we just don't know why there are social classes, why some people are moguls and other people are peasants. It could be anything but evil historical practices? And there are two general classes of answers you might come up with. It could be due to external factors like radiation or disease or not enough meat in the diet, for which the obvious response would be to get those people some hamburgers or antibiotics or lead shields, whatever they need. Or maybe it's the result of nice practices like sharing or hoarding resources, but not evil ancestors. Come on. But if gross inequality is not due to history or to external factors, what else might be causing it? Well, maybe something internal, something organic, something biological is causing the inequality. Gosh, like what, Mr. Scientific Racist? Well, how about head size? As early physical anthropologists like Samuel George Morton suggested in the mid 1800s. Well, we can shoot that down pretty quickly, since the people with the biggest brains aren't necessarily the smartest people, but they are the people who also have the biggest lungs and the biggest livers. That is to say, they're the biggest people. Big people have big brains. But if it were true that big brains cause big intelligence, then the smartest people in the world would be football linemen. And that's just not true. They have the same range of variation in intelligence as everybody else. Maybe it's head shape. Well, let's just say that a century or so of craniometry says that's not true either. So you either decide incorrectly that the question has now been solved cranially, or you look for another biological solution. And if you were a geneticist in the early 20th century, you followed Charles Davenport in the belief that Mendel's laws are universal. And like wrinkled and round peas, there are two kinds of people, smart and stupid. The stupid people have the allele for feeble-mindedness, and that's why they're poor. QED. Problem solved, and you don't have to look any further. Except that that turns out to be wrong as well. No such gene. Which brings us to the 1994 influential bestseller, The Bell Curve. It was written by a genetic determinist psychologist, Herrnstein, and a right-wing political operative, Murray, and was influential for two main reasons. One, it explained why poor people were to blame for their poverty, and two, it was like 70 years out of date, and the scientific community had actually forgotten that there were actually psychologists out there who believed that small variations in IQ scores reflect the expression of innate genetic variables. Within a few years, several complete refutations of the book were in print, but the damage was done. Murray is still out there saying the same old things, but pretty much only talks to hardliners now. The softliners want to believe a psychologist named Catherine Page Hardin, whose book a couple of years ago began by crapping on Charles Murray, but went on to explain how the real cause of differences between the social classes is revealed by super-duper genome correlations known as genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, which can then be transformed into a polygenic score that explains, presumably, your social position. Perhaps she has finally solved the problem. Or perhaps she hasn't. What pseudoscientific theory comes next? Assuming that the answer is anything but evil historical practices. Obviously, the polygenic score doesn't stand up to any level of critical scrutiny. So what is going to come next? Space aliens? These are all simply excuses to try and avoid acknowledging the real known causes of social stratification. This ain't rocket science. It definitely ain't rocket science. It's social science. My point is that it's just as dangerous as rocket science. if not more. Thanks for listening.